My name is Simi. In corporate circles, I was known as sharp, composed, and relentlessly strategic. I built my reputation on numbers, precision, and execution. For 6 years, I gave everything to that company: sleepless nights, back-to-back international flights, impossible deadlines. And when the company's future hinged on a $500 million international merger, I was the one leading it. But power has a way of blinding people. The day my CEO looked at me in a packed boardroom and shouted, "Get out of my office," he thought he was asserting dominance. He believed authority came from the chair he sat in. What he didn't understand was this: real power lives in contracts, clauses, and signatures. And when I walked out of that room, I didn't just leave the meeting. I took the $500 million deal with me. This is the story of ego versus strategy, and how one sentence triggered a corporate checkmate. Absolutely fire. Here's part 1, expanded to around 400 words, with deeper tension, detail, and corporate atmosphere. Part 1. The $500 million blueprint, expanded. The $500 million merger wasn't just another corporate transaction. It was survival. Our company had been struggling with stagnant growth for 2 years. Competitors were expanding aggressively into Asian infrastructure markets, and shareholders were growing impatient. When the opportunity came to partner with a powerful international consortium, everyone knew this deal could redefine our future. And I was placed in charge of structuring it. From day one, I treated the deal like a chessboard. Every move had to anticipate 3 counters. I built a phased capital injection model to protect us from liquidity shock. I designed performance triggers so funds would only release after measurable milestones. I layered risk mitigation clauses to protect against political instability and regulatory shifts. This wasn't guesswork. It was architecture. For 3 months, my life became airports and conference rooms. London for compliance negotiations. Dubai for capital allocation modeling. Singapore for regulatory alignment. I slept on planes, rewrote projections at 3 a.m., and defended our valuation against investors who tried to shave off tens of millions with a single question. The CEO showed up for keynote meetings and press photos. I handled the real negotiations. Investors didn't just see me as a representative. They saw me as the architect of the deal's logic. But experience had taught me something important. Executives often look for scapegoats when pressure rises. So, buried within the agreement was Clause 14C, a continuity protection clause. It stated clearly, if the primary negotiator was terminated without documented cause before deal closure, the agreement would automatically pause pending independent review. It wasn't sabotage. It was protection for the integrity of the negotiation. I submitted the final draft to legal and the board. It was approved without debate. No one questioned the clause. Especially not the CEO. He saw a $500 million headline. I saw a structured system designed to withstand instability. Neither of us knew how soon that clause would be tested. Love the pace relieved face fire. Here's part 2, expanded to around 400 words, with more tension and emotional depth. Part 2, the public dismissal, expanded. The boardroom felt electric that morning. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows reflected the skyline behind us, and the long polished table was lined with directors, legal advisors, and senior executives. On the main screen, investors from 3 countries were dialed in. This was the final presentation before signing. Months of work. Billions in projected long-term growth. Everything came down to this meeting. I stood at the head of the table, remote in hand, walking through the final revenue projections. Our conservative estimate shows a 14% return in the first 18 months, with risk hedging built into Phase 2 capital deployment, I explained, switching slides smoothly. Halfway through the financial breakdown, the CEO interrupted. "These numbers are too aggressive." His tone wasn't curious. It was confrontational. I kept my composure. They're stress-tested under 3 downturn scenarios. Even under reduced infrastructure demand, we remain protected through staggered capital release. A few board members nodded. The CFO glanced at the model again. But the CEO leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. "You've been making independent decisions beyond your authority," he said sharply. The room stiffened. That wasn't true. Every structural element had board approval. But this wasn't about facts. It was about control. I've operated fully within board-approved parameters, I replied calmly. He suddenly slammed his palm on the table. The sound echoed against the glass walls. I'm the CEO, not you. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Then he said it. Get out of my office. Right now. In front of everyone. No private conversation. No warning. Just a public dismissal meant to assert dominance. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Some shocked. Some sympathetic. Some simply avoiding eye contact. My heartbeat was steady, surprisingly. I closed my laptop slowly. As you wish, I said. Evenly, professionally. No anger. No raised voice. I walked out without rushing. Inside the elevator, once the doors shut, I exhaled. Not in defeat, in calculation. Then I unlocked my phone and typed a single message to legal counsel. Activate Clause 14C, termination without cause. Effective immediately. I hit send. The boardroom explosion had just triggered a contractual one. And this time, the damage wouldn't be emotional. It would be financial.
Chess pawn.
By the time I reached the parking garage, the legal machinery was already moving. Clause 14C wasn't symbolic. It was automated protocol. Once activated, formal notice had to be issued to all transaction stakeholders within hours. And that's exactly what happened. At 2:17 p.m., the International Consortium received an official legal notification. Primary negotiator terminated without documented cause. Transaction suspended pending governance review. The effect was immediate. The $500 million deal, months of negotiation, strategic positioning, media anticipation froze. Investor confidence doesn't disappear slowly. It drops like a switch. Within the next hour, internal Slack channels lit up. Analysts began calling the CFO. The stock dipped 4% before market close. Financial journalists caught wind of the unexpected instability. By evening, headlines were circulating. Major infrastructure merger faces sudden halt. Meanwhile, I sat at home calm, not celebrating, not panicking, just observing. Because this wasn't revenge. It was structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. Around 7 p.m., my phone rang. The CFO. What happened? He asked, tension obvious. What happened, I replied evenly, is that I was terminated publicly without cause while serving as the deal's primary signatory authority. Silence.
He knew what that meant.
Without me reinstated or cleared through independent review, the investors were legally protected from proceeding. The consortium had zero incentive to move forward under unstable leadership. And instability now had a face. The CEO. Late that night, emergency board emails started circulating. Directors demanded clarification. Investors requested written explanation. The problem wasn't just my dismissal. The problem was governance risk. If a CEO could impulsively remove the architect of a $500 million deal in the middle of final approval, what else could he destabilize? That question terrified investors far more than any clause ever could. For the first time since he yelled at me, the CEO wasn't in control of the room. Because the room had expanded. Now it included shareholders, markets, international partners. And contracts don't respond to shouting. They respond to triggers.
Chess pawn.
Let's turn up the pressure fire. Here's part 4, expanded, 400 words. Part 4, pressure rising. The next morning felt different. Not chaotic, strategic. By 8 a.m., the company's stock had opened down nearly 7%. Financial analysts were questioning leadership stability on live television. The phrase, executive mismanagement, was already trending in business circles. And the board? They were in damage control mode. At 9:12 a.m., my phone rang. It was him. The CEO's voice sounded controlled, but tighter than usual. Simi, we need to talk. I didn't rush to respond. I'm listening. This has escalated unnecessarily. Unnecessarily. Interesting choice of words. With respect, I said calmly, The escalation occurred when I was terminated without cause during a live board session. Silence again. He knew the board had witnesses. The investors had witnesses. This wasn't something that could be reframed quietly. You know the market is reacting, he continued. This suspension is hurting the company. The clause exists to protect the company, I replied. From instability. That word landed. Instability. Because now the instability had a name, and it wasn't mine. By midday, I received calls from 2 board directors. Their tone had shifted dramatically from the day before. We didn't anticipate this clause having such immediate impact. Of course they hadn't. They approved it without scrutiny. By afternoon, the consortium's legal team issued a formal inquiry demanding written clarification of leadership continuity. In other words, is this CEO stable enough to close a $500 million deal? That question carried more weight than any argument I could make. Around 5 p.m., the chairman of the board contacted me directly. What would it take to resolve this? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Public reinstatement, formal clarification of authority, and written assurance that executive decisions impacting active transactions require board review. No emotion, no anger, just governance. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Yesterday, I was the employee asked to leave. Today, I was the condition required to move forward. And the CEO? For the first time, he wasn't controlling the narrative. He was reacting to it.
Chess pawn.
Let's bring her back into the room.
Fire.
Here's Part 5. Expanded, 400 words. Part 5. The boardroom return. 3 days after the suspension, an emergency board meeting was scheduled. This time, the atmosphere wasn't electric. It was heavy, controlled, cautious. When I received the formal invitation, it wasn't casual. It was marked governance review and transaction continuity. Translation: we need you. I arrived 10 minutes early. Same building, same glass walls, same polished table. But the energy had shifted. Conversations stopped when I walked in. Not out of hostility, out of awareness. The board members who once avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully. Even the CFO stood to greet me. The CEO was already seated at the head of the table. His posture stiff, expression unreadable. The chairman opened the meeting. We are here to address leadership actions taken during the final transaction session and their impact on shareholder value. Clean language. Sharp message. Legal counsel presented a summary of Clause 14C and confirmed that activation had followed protocol. No breach. No manipulation. Just execution of agreed structure. Then came the uncomfortable part. The chairman turned to the CEO. Was Ms. Simi terminated with documented cause?
A pause.
No, he admitted. The room absorbed it. Investors were listening remotely. After discussion, the board voted. Majority decision. The termination was procedurally unjustified and materially harmful to shareholder interests. A formal resolution was drafted immediately. I was publicly reinstated as lead transaction authority. A written apology was entered into the record. The clause suspension was lifted. But something else happened in that room, something more subtle. The power perception changed. Not because I argued, not because I raised my voice, but because structure outperformed ego. As the meeting closed, the chairman addressed me directly. Ms. Simi, will you continue leading the transaction? I met his gaze steadily.
Yes.
Under full governance compliance. A reminder. The deal resumed that afternoon. But the CEO? He no longer looked like the most powerful person in the room. And everyone knew it.
Chess pawn.
Oh, now we enter the silent power phase, relieved face chess pawn. Here's Part 6. Expanded. 400 words. Part 6. Quiet leverage. After the reinstatement, the headlines calmed. The stock stabilized. The $500 million deal resumed. On the surface, everything looked resolved. But corporate consequences don't explode. They unfold quietly. Within 48 hours of my return, the International Consortium submitted a formal governance concern letter. It wasn't aggressive, it was clinical. They requested executive decision review protocols, Risk management audit. Leadership stability assessment. Translation? They didn't trust impulsive leadership anymore. The board had no choice but to comply. A third-party governance audit firm was brought in. Internal communications were reviewed. Executive decision trails were documented. And I said nothing. No accusations. No complaints. No, I told you so. I focused only on closing the deal. That's the thing about leverage. Once you have it, you don't need to wave it around. Over the next few weeks, subtle fractures began appearing. The audit uncovered a pattern of unilateral decisions made by the CEO over the past year. Minor ones at first, bypassing procurement oversight, overriding compliance concerns. Nothing catastrophic. But together, they formed a narrative. Impulsive leadership risk. In investor language, that's deadly. Meanwhile, I maintained steady communication with the consortium. Transparent updates. Clean reporting. Clear frameworks. Stability. Board members began consulting me more frequently, not just about the deal, but about broader strategic direction. One director said quietly after a session, "You think 3 moves ahead." I didn't smile.
I didn't react.
Because this wasn't about validation. It was about positioning. The CEO still occupied the corner office. But influence had shifted. He spoke, and people analyzed. I spoke, and people implemented. That's the difference between authority and credibility. By the time the governance audit report was finalized, the conclusion wasn't dramatic. It was simple. Leadership decision volatility presents material risk during high-value transactions. No names. But everyone knew exactly who that sentence referred to. And in corporate chess, once the board sees the king exposed, the game is already decided. Chess pawn fire. Quarterly earnings season arrived at the worst possible time. Normally, these presentations were routine, polished slides, confident forecasts, controlled messaging. But this one felt different.
Tense.
The governance audit had been circulated privately to major investors. Nothing explosive. Nothing scandalous. Just careful wording. Leadership volatility. Executive override patterns. Transaction instability exposure. In corporate language, those phrases are warning shots. The CEO stood at the podium during the earnings call, outlining revenue growth projections tied to the $500 million merger. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Then the questions began. An institutional investor asked, "What safeguards are now in place to prevent executive-level disruption of strategic transactions?" Not if. Prevent. Another analyst followed. How is leadership continuity being evaluated post-incident? Post-incident. The word hung in the air. For the first time since I joined the company, I saw hesitation in him. A slight pause before answering. A tightening of his jaw. He spoke about alignment and collaboration. But the confidence wasn't landing. Markets sense uncertainty faster than executives do. By the end of the call, the stock had stabilized, but investor sentiment had shifted. Internally, directors began meeting without him. Succession planning discussions started quietly. I wasn't invited at first. But 2 days later, the chairman requested a private conversation. "We need long-term stability," he said carefully. "The board must consider all outcomes." That was the first time it was spoken aloud. Leadership transition. Within weeks, pressure mounted. Large shareholders signaled they would not support future expansion under unstable governance. And then it happened. A short press release.
Clean.
Neutral. Effective immediately, the company announces leadership restructuring to align with long-term strategic objectives. He resigned. No scandal. No public collapse. Just removal through structured consequence. The same structure he underestimated. As I watched the announcement circulate, I didn't feel victory. Just confirmation. In boardrooms, kings don't fall from shouting matches. They fall from documented patterns. And this game had never been emotional. It had always been positional.
Chess pawn.
2 days after the resignation announcement, I received a message from the chairman's office. Private meeting. 6:30 p.m. No subject line. No explanation. I arrived just as the sun was setting behind the skyline. The executive floor felt strangely calm, almost transitional, like a building between eras. The chairman was already seated when I walked in. No dramatic setup. Just a folder placed neatly on the table between us. "We need stability," he began. "And credibility." I didn't interrupt. He continued, "The consortium has made it clear. Their confidence lies with the transaction architecture and the person who built it."
He slid the folder toward me.
Inside was a formal proposal. Interim Chief Executive Officer. Effective immediately. For a moment, the irony almost felt cinematic. The same office I had been publicly expelled from. The same chair that symbolized authority over me. Now being offered. But I didn't react emotionally. Under what governance framework? I asked. The chairman leaned back slightly, almost approvingly. Explain. No unilateral executive overrides on active strategic transactions. Major leadership decisions require board review. Performance metrics tied to capital stability, not ego-driven expansion. I wasn't interested in a title. I was interested in structure. He nodded slowly. Agreed. The decision wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about reclaiming dignity. That had already been restored the moment the board voted for my reinstatement. This was about preventing the same instability from ever happening again. The next morning, the press release was clean and efficient. Simi appointed interim CEO to ensure transaction continuity and strategic stability. Markets responded positively. The stock rose 5% by midday. Investors called it a restorative move. But inside the building, something more significant had shifted. Authority no longer came from volume. It came from trust. And trust, once earned through structure and discipline, is far stronger than fear. As I stepped into the CEO office later that evening, I didn't sit immediately. I stood there for a moment, not admiring the view, assessing the board. Because in corporate chess, promotion isn't the endgame. It's the beginning of a new one.
Chess pawn.
Now we close the circle. This is where strategy becomes legacy. Chess pawn fire. Here's part 9, expanded 400 words. Part 9, the close. 6 months after the crisis, the $500 million deal officially closed. No drama. No last-minute instability. Just disciplined execution. Under my leadership, the transaction moved through final compliance review, regulatory clearance, and phased capital release exactly as structured in the original blueprint. Nothing flashy. Nothing rushed. Predictable. And in corporate finance, predictable is powerful. The International Consortium's board flew in for the signing ceremony. This time, the atmosphere was intense. It was confident, controlled, strategic. When I signed the final document, it wasn't symbolic. It was validation. The same agreement that had once frozen under Clause 14C was now activating Phase 1 capital injection, $200 million immediately allocated to infrastructure expansion. Within weeks, market response was decisive. Company valuation climbed sharply. Analysts revised growth projections upward. Business media reframed the narrative entirely. Stability restored. Strategic leadership drives landmark merger. But what mattered most wasn't the headlines. It was internal culture. Executive meetings shifted tone. Discussions became structured, documented, performance-driven. No one interrupted presentations to assert dominance anymore, because the system no longer allowed it. Governance protocols I had negotiated during my acceptance as interim CEO were now embedded into company policy. Executive authority required documented justification. Strategic dismissals required board oversight. Structure replaced ego. One evening, after reviewing quarterly growth reports, the chairman said quietly, "You didn't fight for power. You redesigned it." That was the real difference. This was never about winning an argument. It was about redesigning the board so instability couldn't repeat itself. The CEO once believed authority came from the ability to remove someone from a room. But true authority comes from building a system that outlasts personalities. As the merger's first milestone payments reflected in our financial reports, I understood something clearly. The moment he yelled, "Get out," he thought he was ending my influence. In reality, He had triggered the very mechanism that would transfer it. And in chess, the cleanest checkmate is the one your opponent walks into on their own.
Chess pawn.
The transition from interim CEO to permanent appointment happened quietly. No dramatic vote. No celebration. Just performance. 6 months of stable execution. Strong quarterly growth. Successful capital deployment. Restored investor confidence. The board formalized the decision during a routine governance session. Simi is hereby appointed Chief Executive Officer. Simple. Procedural. But the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The same boardroom where I had once been told to leave. The same table. The same skyline reflecting through the glass. Only this time, there was no tension in the air. Just clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my demeanor. Leadership, to me, was never about dominance. It was about design. Over the following months, we expanded into 2 new regional markets using the same phased capital framework. Risk exposure remained controlled. Investor reporting became transparent and disciplined. Inside the company, culture shifted permanently. Presentations were respected. Decisions required documentation. Authority became accountable. The old CEO's name slowly faded from internal conversations. Not because he was erased, but because systems don't remember ego. They remember outcomes. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I stood by the window overlooking the city. I replayed that moment in the boardroom months ago, the slam of his hand against the table. The command, "Get out." If I had reacted emotionally, raised my voice, or tried to defend myself in that moment, the outcome would have been different. Instead, I chose structure. And structure doesn't argue. It activates. The real lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding leverage. Titles can be taken away. Voices can be silenced. But contracts, governance, and discipline strategy, those endure. The CEO thought power was the ability to remove someone from a room. I learned power is the ability to redesign the room entirely. And that was the final checkmate.
Chess pawn.
When people hear this story, they think it's about revenge. They imagine anger, plotting, late-night strategy sessions fueled by pride. But that's not what this was. This was about discipline. The day I was told to get out, I felt the sting of humiliation. I won't pretend I didn't. Being dismissed publicly, in front of colleagues and investors, is something you don't forget. But in high-stakes environments, reaction is a luxury you can't afford. In that moment, I had 2 choices. I could defend my ego, or I could protect the structure. I chose structure, because corporate power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who builds the most resilient system. The clause I activated wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was governance, written months earlier with foresight, not fear. And that's the difference between reacting and preparing. People often underestimate quiet competence. They mistake composure for weakness. They assume that if someone doesn't shout back, they've surrendered. But sometimes silence isn't submission. Sometimes it's calculation. Leadership taught me something simple. Authority based on ego collapses under pressure. Authority based on structure survives it. The CEO believed control came from his title. I understood that control comes from alignment between contracts, investors, board oversight, and disciplined execution. When the deal closed and the company stabilized, it wasn't because I defeated someone. It was because the system worked. And systems don't care about pride. They care about design. If there's one lesson in all of this, it's this. Read the fine print. Build leverage before you need it. Stay calm when others escalate. Because the most powerful move in any room isn't raising your voice. It's knowing that when the board shifts, you already positioned yourself 3 moves ahead. Chess pawn fire.